Every warship in the Terran fleet carried a weather officer. Every one of them was used to being the punchline. Space, went the old joke, has no weather. The people who told that joke had never lived with an angry star. Dr. Elin Sorensen had lived with one for 11 years. Kestrel, the son of the Halvard system, was a flare star, a bad-tempered orange dwarf that threw tantrums measured in billions of tons of burning plasma. Sorensen was not a soldier. She was a civilian stellar physicist who had come to Halvard on a 3-year research grant and stayed for the star, building the finest solar observatory in colonized space and a model of Kestrel's moods that she had tuned, storm by storm, for over a decade. The colony's 400,000 settlers scheduled harvests, flights, and weddings by her forecasts. Then the war arrived at Halvard, and the fleet drafted her and gave her a lieutenant's bars she never learned to pin on straight. The strategic picture was brutally simple. Halvard sat on the flank of humanity's whole frontier line. If it fell, the enemy gained a base inside our defenses, and every world behind it came into raid range. The Cetari knew this, which is why they were sending 90 warships to take it. Defending Halvard were 42 human ships under Admiral Osei, a careful, unlucky man who had spent the war being right about battles he lost anyway. 42 against 90. The relief fleet was a month away. Every simulation command ended the same way, and Osei had stopped running them. Which is how it came to pass that the most important military briefing in the Halvard system was delivered by a rumpled civilian holding a coffee cup, pointing not at the enemy's formation, but at a sun. Kestrel is going to do something enormous in 9 days, Elin Sorensen told the assembled captains. I know it 8 days before they possibly can. Gentlemen, ladies, that is the only weapon in this system that we have more of than they do. To understand what Sorensen was offering, the captains had to first unlearn the joke. Space has weather, it simply is not made of rain. A flare star like Kestrel does not merely shine. Periodically, its tangled magnetic field snaps and reconnects, and when it does, the star fires a flare, a flash of radiation that crosses the system at the speed of light, followed hours later by the coronal mass ejection, a wall of magnetized plasma the size of 100 worlds, rolling outward at 2,000 kilometers a second. To a planet with a magnetic field, it is an inconvenience and an aurora. To a warship in open space, it is a catastrophe. Sensors drown in noise. Shields, built to swallow directed fire, gulp down the storm's broadside until their capacitors scream. Missiles lose lock, drones lose their handlers, and communications lasers scatter in the ionized flood. Fleets do not fight through a major flare. Fleets shelter from it, behind planetary magnetospheres, in radiation shadow, and wait, blind, until the sky heals. Sorensen's observatory ringed Kestrel with sensor buoys that watched the star's surface writhe in real time, 11 years of data deep. She could recognize an active region loading toward failure the way a physician recognizes a failing heart from rhythm alone. Her current charts showed the largest magnetic knot she had ever recorded, winding tighter daily, and her model gave it 9 days, with a window of confidence measured in hours. The Cetari would see it too, eventually. Their fleet carried instruments, and their instruments would catch the pre-flare brightening like anyone's. But they were sailing, not parked beside the star with 11 years of intimacy. They would get a day of warning. Sorensen had 9. Admiral Osei, the careful man, asked the careful question. What exactly do you propose we do with 8 days that they will not have? Everything, Sorensen said. You cannot outgun them, Admiral. So we are going to make the sky itself pick a side, and we are going to know, to the hour, when it changes its mind. The Cetari fleet made orbit at the system's edge on the 3rd day, and the war for Halvard opened the way everyone had known it must badly. 90 warships advanced in a broad crescent, deliberate and unhurried, the formation of a commander with every advantage and no reason to gamble. Osei's 42 met them in a series of delaying actions among the outer moons, sharp, running fights that traded space for time. The human squadrons fought well, and it did not matter. The destroyer Callaway was lost on the 3rd day with all hands. On the fourth, the cruiser Pallas limped out of the line with her drive cut nearly through. The crescent came on, patient as arithmetic, herding the defenders back toward Halvard itself and the fortress Moon, whose guns were the colony's last hard shell. Aboard the flagship, Sorensen barely saw the battles. She lived in a converted signals compartment walled with Kestrel's furious face, feeds from her boys streaming in on laser relay, and she watched her magnetic knot coil toward its snapping point and felt the strangest guilt of her life. 400,000 people below, a fleet bleeding above. And she was praying, fervently, for the storm of the century to arrive on time. Her model held. The precursors marched through her checklists one by one, the active region brightening, the coronal loops rising and straining like cables about to part. On the seventh day, she walked into Osei's cabin and put a single number in front of him. The flare would erupt in 40 to 52 hours. The ejection wall would sweep the inner system between 9 and 14 hours after that. For roughly a day, no ship in Halvard space would be able to see, shoot, or speak across more than a few thousand kilometers. Osei studied the number the way he studied everything, looking for its failure mode. "If you are wrong," he said, "I will have parked my fleet and handed them Halvard." "If I am wrong," Sorensen said, "we lose exactly what we lose anyway. If I am right, we get the one day of this war in which 90 ships cannot aim." The fleet spent the next 40 hours preparing to fight a battle inside a hurricane, and the preparations were like nothing in the tactical manuals. Every human warship was hardened against the storm to a standard. No Navy peacetime-rated reactor plasma conduits shrouded in salvaged hull plate, sensor arrays retracted or sacrificed, crews drilled to fight from armored citadels deep in each hull. Gunnery officers, stripped of targeting systems, requalified on techniques from the Naval Museum, optical sighting, plotted fire, salvo discipline by chronometer. The engineers grumbled that Sorensen was making them build ships for a war before computers. She told them that for one day, that was precisely the war they would be fighting, and the side that accepted it first would win it. The heart of the plan was position. When the flare struck, both fleets would go blind, but blindness is only equal if both sides are guessing. The human fleet would not guess. In the hours before the ejection wall arrived, Osei's ships would take up stations in the radiation shadow of Halvard's outer gas giant, powered down to embers on trajectories Sorensen plotted around the storm's own physics. Then, sightless, on inertia and clockwork alone, they would fall across the space where the enemy had to shelter. Because that was the trap's cold logic, shelter in Halvard's system existed in exactly two places, and the humans held the better one. The Cetari, when their instruments finally screamed at them, would have hours to reach cover and only one real choice: the magnetosphere of the inner ice giant. Sorensen could not know their formation, but she knew their harbor because the sky left them no other. She stood before the assembled captains one last time, a civilian in a badly fitted uniform, and gave the fleet its sailing orders from a weather chart. The storm reaches the inner system at hour 0. Their shields will be drinking it. Their sensors will be sand. Hold your plots, trust your clocks, and at hour 6 you will be among them before either fleet can see the other. The difference is, we will know where we are. 42 against 90. Said a cruiser captain quietly. Sorensen shook her head. 42, she said, plus the star. Kestrel's flare erupted 46 hours after Sorensen's forecast, inside her window, and it was everything her instruments had promised, the largest event in 11 recorded years, a lash of light that made the daytime sky of Halvard flicker and the colony's auroras burn down to the equator. Across the system, both fleets did exactly what competent fleets do. The Cetari had caught the pre-flare brightening a day earlier, just as Sorensen predicted, and their commander was no fool. 90 warships broke off the advance in good order and ran for the ice giant's magnetic shadow, tucking into shelter with a professionalism that Osei's staff watched with sinking hearts. There would be no catching them strung out in the open. When the ejection wall arrived, 11 hours behind the flash, and the whole inner system drowned in roaring plasma, the enemy was safely harbored, buttoned down, riding out the storm by the book. The book was the problem, Sorensen knew, pacing her compartment while static ate her boy feeds one by one. Fleets shelter through a storm and emerge when it passes. Kestrel's ejection would take perhaps 20 hours to sweep through. Hour 6, the heart of the blindness, was the human fleet's moment, and the human fleet was already falling toward the enemy harbor, dark and silent, on plots she had drawn. Then, at hour 3, with her instruments nearly blind, Sorensen saw it. Buried in the last clean data from her innermost buoy, the flare's magnetic shockwave, rebounding through Kestrel's corona, had raked across the star's second active region, the sullen knot she had been watching for weeks and rated quiet. It was quiet no longer. The rhythms were compressing, the loops straining, the failing heart signature unmistakable and accelerating. A sympathetic flare. The rarest and most violent trick in a flare star's repertoire, a second eruption, triggered by the first, striking while the sky was already ruined. Her model, 11 years of a single star's moods, gave it 14 hours, which meant it would arrive at almost exactly the moment the first storm faded, when 90 Cetari warships, believing the weather over, sailed out of harbor into the open to resume their conquest. The sky was about to lie to everyone in the system, except her. Getting the fleet to change its battle plan in the middle of a radiation storm, on the word of one civilian, based on data nobody else could verify, from instruments that were now blind, was, Sorensen would say much later, the actual battle of Halvard. Everything after it was gunnery. Laser relay to the flagship still functioned across short range, and she spent 2 of her 14 hours arguing into it. The original plan, the hour 6 strike into the enemy harbor, was good. Her new forecast made it a mistake. Attack at hour 6, and the humans would spend their one ambush breaking perhaps a third of a sheltered, anchored enemy. But hold, wait through the long blindness, let the first storm die, and the Cetari would do the irrevocable thing. They would leave harbor. 90 ships in transit formation, shields cycling down from storm load, sensors just recovering, crews exhausted from 20 hours at storm stations, strung out in open space. And then Kestrel would strike them a second time, and the humans, forewarned and hardened, would strike inside its light. Osei's reply came back down the laser after 11 minutes that aged her a year. You are asking me to bet the system on lightning striking twice. It is not twice, she sent back. It is one storm with 2 hands, and I have watched this star for 11 years, and I am telling you when the second hand falls. The admiral, the careful man who had spent a war being right and losing anyway, made the decision that put his name in the histories. He chose the forecast. The fleet, already falling dark toward the enemy harbor, adjusted its plots by fractions of a degree, and instead of attacking at hour 6, it drifted past the harbor's mouth and took up new stations, astride the one course the Cetari would sail when they believed the weather had cleared. At the exact range where a hardened fleet could survive what was coming and an unwarned one could not. 42 ships hung in the roaring dark, engines cold, clocks running, crews sealed in citadel armor, waiting on the word of a woman watching a blind screen and counting her star's heartbeats from memory. The first storm faded on schedule, and the sky over Halvard performed its great deception flawlessly. Radiation counts fell, sensor flaws cleared. Stars came back one constellation at a time, and to every instrument in the Cetari fleet, the weather event was ending exactly as their own forecasters had modeled it. Their commander did what the book, every book, said to do. He put 90 warships back into motion at once, transit formation, best economical speed, to regain the days the storm had cost before the humans, presumably still cowering behind their gas giant, could reorganize. His ships ran with shields cycled low for post-storm diagnostics, and sensor crews focused on recalibration. It was proper procedure in every navy that had ever sailed. It assumed only one thing, that the sky tells the same truth to everyone. 14 hours and 9 minutes after Sorensen marked the second active region, 7 minutes inside her window, Kestrel fired its second hand. The sympathetic flare was worse than the first, and this time there were no hours of grace, because the humans needed none and the Cetari were not granted any. The flash hit 90 ships in open space with shields low and arrays extended for recalibration. Sensor masts that had just been lovingly retuned burned out in seconds. Shield capacitors, still hot from 20 hours of storm load, drank the new broadside and began failing in cascades down the enemy line. The second ejection wall came roaring behind the light, and the Cetari fleet, mid-transit, nowhere near shelter, could do nothing but seal up, spread out, and endure, blind and deaf and scattered across 100,000 kilometers of burning space. They assumed, every captain among them, that the enemy was equally stricken. It was the reasonable assumption. It lasted until human warships began emerging from the storm at point-blank range. Osei's fleet came in on clockwork and dead plots, hardened, sighted by eye, exactly where Sorensen's geometry had promised the enemy column would be. The first Cetari ship to die never saw a sensor return. Her escorts saw only muzzle flashes in the plasma glow, like lightning inside a thundercloud. The engagement that followed appears in the tactical literature under a name no one has improved upon: the knife fight in the rain. No battle like it had been fought in 2 centuries of space warfare, and none has been fought since, because it required a set of conditions and a fleet built in 40 desperate hours to exploit them. Combat opened at ranges under 3,000 kilometers, eyeball ranges, with both sides' long sensors dead and missiles useless in the ionized flood. It was railguns laid by optics, torpedoes fired down bearings plotted with rulers, salvos timed by chronometer against ships glimpsed in the stormlight. It was, in every way that mattered, the naval warfare of the pre-computer age, resurrected inside a star's tantrum. And at that ancient game, only one fleet had practiced. Human gun crews who had grumbled through optical requalification put their first salvos into hulls whose crews were still fighting their own blinded systems. Human squadrons held formation through the storm on clockwork drills, wheeling together, crossing the scattered Cetari column at right angles and hammering each isolated division in turn. The hardening the engineers had cursed kept human reactors stable and citadels breathable, while Cetari damage parties fought fires their designers had never modeled, because their designers had never planned to fight inside weather. The Cetari were not cowards, and the record honors this. Their divisions fought hard, alone, in the dark. But a fleet is not 90 ships, it is 90 ships that can speak to each other, and the storm had taken their voice. Each division learned about the human fleet the same way, suddenly, from close aboard, and none could warn the next. By the 8th hour inside the second storm, a third of the Cetari fleet was destroyed, drifting, or struck. The rest was a fleet only on paper. And at hour 9 came the moment every documentary rebuilds. The enemy flagship, guns silent, arrays burned, drifting beam on to 3 human cruisers she could hear but not find, chose the storm's one remaining channel, a low-frequency band that punched through the roar and broadcast in the clear. Halvard's Aurora was still burning overhead when the surrender came through. What happened in the last hours of the storm is the part of the battle that Halvard's colonists tell most often, though it involved no gunfire at all. The Cetari surrender left thousands of enemy sailors trapped in crippled ships, scattered through a radiation storm, with reactors failing, life support bleeding out, and no fleet left to save them. Standard doctrine, every navy's doctrine, said the victors shelter in place and process prisoners when the sky clears. The storm still had 11 hours to run, and every one of those hours was lethal to an unshielded rescue craft. Admiral Osei asked his weather officer one question: could she route small craft through it? Sorensen had spent the battle proving she knew where the storm was strongest. Now she inverted her own model and charted where it was weakest, the eddies and shadows and momentary calms in Kestrel's roaring exhale, corridors of survivable sky that shifted hour by hour. Human rescue shuttles and destroyer boat crews flew those corridors on her voice, relayed ship to ship down the laser chain into the wreckage of the fleet they had just broken, and began cutting enemy survivors out of the dark. The Cetari sailors, sealed in dying citadels, had been taught what humans were, a frontier species, savage in war, indifferent in victory. What came through their hulls instead were rescue crews in storm-hardened suits, following weather instructions from a civilian scientist, hauling out every living being they could reach before the next surge closed the corridor. 1,140 enemy personnel were taken alive out of the storm. The last shuttle cleared the wreck field 19 minutes before Sorensen's final corridor slammed shut, and her voice on the relay, calm to the last syllable, is preserved in the fleet archive. Years afterward, at the armistice talks, the senior Cetari delegate was asked why his government had come to trust human terms at all. The old commander, the one who had surrendered his flagship at Halvard, gave the answer, entered into the record. They came into their own storm, he said, to take our people out of it. The second storm passed. Kestrel subsided into its ordinary orange sulk, and the sky over Halvard healed to reveal the arithmetic rewritten of 90 Cetari warships. 29 escaped the system under a junior commodore. 61 were destroyed, disabled, or surrendered at station keeping under human guns, including the flagship and her entire command staff. Human losses came to 5 ships and 812 names, which the colony carved into the observatory's foundation stone, a location nobody questioned. The Battle of Halvard broke the enemy's flank campaign in a single day. But its longer echo was doctrinal, and it is the reason every academy in human space now teaches the engagement in 2 different courses. The tacticians study the knife fight. The strategists study the forecast. Because the after-action analysis established what Sorensen had understood from the beginning, the Cetari commander made no serious errors. His instruments were good, his forecasters competent, his storm procedures textbook. He sheltered correctly from the flare he could see and sailed correctly when it ended. He was beaten by 11 years of one woman's intimacy with one particular star, an intimacy that no instrument aboard a passing fleet could replicate. He was beaten, as the official history puts it, by the home sky. The fleet offered Elin Sorensen a commission, a directorate, and a transfer to the Strategic Weather Service being founded, in large part because of her. She accepted the directorate on the condition that it be headquartered at Halvard in her observatory with her boys beside her bad-tempered star. The service she built now rings every flare star on the frontier with instruments and residents, physicists who live with their sons for decades, because Halvard proved that the difference between data and knowledge is measured in years, and that the difference can be worth a fleet. Her lieutenant's bars, still crooked, are displayed in the Academy's weather school under glass, with the joke engraved beneath them, the old joke, retired from service at last and pinned like a trophy. Space has no weather. Ask the 61 ships that anchored in it. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. A new one leaves Earth every day.